Good evening, everyone. The story I'm about to share is deeply unsettling and chilling. My name is Natalia, and I was a nurse at a government hospital. I covered some night shifts during the week, and my partner and I were responsible for the entire third floor. Everything began one night while I was working at the hospital. We didn't have many patients that evening. It was a very quiet night when suddenly I heard a terrifying scream coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. I immediately ran to check the only two occupied rooms in that corridor, but upon entering, I found both patients asleep. So, it wasn't them. I entered the other rooms to ensure no one was inside because I was certain of what I had heard, but they were all empty. I went to the other wing of the floor to check on the other patients, as my partner had asked me to cover for him while he stepped out to make a quick call. I was in a patient's room, administering their medication to help them sleep when that scream, or whatever it was, echoed again from the far end of the other hallway. It sounded like the wailing of a wounded animal. I can't describe how horrible it was. My patient heard it too, and just stared at me. I immediately went out to check again. As I walked down the hallway, I heard it once more. Sure, it came from room 23. Approaching the door, I hesitated before opening it, feeling scared. I opened it slowly, turned on the light, and it was completely empty. I turned off the light, closed the door, and was heading back when I heard someone crying in that same room, like the sobbing of a small child. I didn't want to go back and open the door again. I preferred to wait for my partner, but I kept hearing the cries and whimpers. It was terrifying. Finally, my partner returned, and I told him everything that had happened. I asked him to come with me to check again, as the crying had continued in that room the whole time he was gone. As we approached, we could hear the cries of a child inside. He gestured for me to be quiet as he slowly opened the door, but upon fully opening it, the crying stopped. He turned on the lights, and the room was empty. We were shocked and tried to find an explanation, but there wasn't one. My partner had to continue with his work, and I stayed in my area attending to the other patients. Time passed, and while I was with one of them, a young man who had been there for several days, he asked me about the child. I asked which one, and he said, the one in room 23. He heard it crying, and often heard it cry at night. He wondered why its parents hadn't come to see it or what was wrong. I didn't know how to respond, as it was the first time I heard the crying. So, I told him there were no patients in that room and that we didn't have any children admitted on that floor. He looked surprised and took a few seconds to respond. He then told me that every night a small child had been peeking into his room, not opening the door fully, but enough to see it was a little one just watching him through the small opening the door created. He always asked for its name and why it should be in its room at night, but the child never responded, just left. And he could see from his window how this child would enter room number 23, so he thought there was a small patient there. After he told me all this, he looked at me with eyes full of uncertainty and fear. I was honestly very scared, but didn't want to make him nervous as it could affect his health. So I suggested maybe I was mistaken, and perhaps there was a child admitted in the other wing of the floor. But he shouldn't worry. He wasn't very convinced. I went straight to find my floor partner to tell him everything the young man had shared. Like me, he was very surprised and didn't know what to say. He mentioned he didn't believe in ghosts but couldn't explain it otherwise. Both of us were new. We hadn't been at the hospital long and didn't know the history of that room. The next day, I found out a 40-year-old woman had been admitted and placed in room 23. I didn't say anything at the moment, but when the doctor was giving me instructions on her medication and care, I couldn't help but ask why she was placed there if many rooms were vacant. The doctor, puzzled, asked if there was a problem. I said no, just curious, as I didn't want to share the strange events. I was embarrassed and knew he wouldn't believe me. Hours passed, and by 11 p.m. all patients were sleeping, and the floor was eerily quiet. Suddenly, I heard a scream, but it wasn't the same one I had heard before. It also came from the end of the hallway, from room 23. I ran to see what was happening. Upon entering, I found the newly admitted woman on the floor. I helped her up, and she was very agitated, asking me to turn on the light. She was scared, telling me she was about to fall asleep when she felt a small hand touch her arm, followed by a faint murmur she couldn't understand. She was so frightened that she jumped out of bed and fell. I didn't know what to say, just asked if she had seen anyone, but she said no. The room was too dark to see, but she begged me not to leave her alone because she was terrified. Since being admitted to that room, she had felt a sense of fear and distress. She had asked the doctor if her husband could stay with her overnight, but the hospital's strict rules didn't allow it. I agreed to stay with her until she fell asleep. The energy in that room was unsettling. I was neither comfortable nor at ease, but couldn't leave her alone. Thanks to the medication, she fell asleep quickly. I turned off the light and went to check on my other patients, but not even 3 minutes had passed when I heard a horrible scream. The same child's scream from the night before, coming from that room. I ran, knowing the woman was there. Upon entering and turning on the light, I found her passed out on the floor. She had suffered a heart attack. We called the doctor on duty and tried to revive her multiple times. We did everything to save her life, but it was in vain. She passed away. The doctor asked if anything unusual had happened because he couldn't understand how she suddenly suffered a heart attack when she was admitted for a stomach problem and wasn't in serious condition. I couldn't hold back any longer and told him everything that had happened since the day before, trying to stay strong and not cry. He told me to calm down and meet him in the cafeteria after my shift. I didn't know why he wanted to see me, but I agreed. After my shift, I went to the cafeteria, as he had asked. He told me to sit down. He wanted to share something. He began to explain what he believed had happened. He had worked at the hospital for many years and was now an elderly doctor. He shared that when he started working there, the hospital belonged to a very powerful ex-senator at the time. He warned me that for my safety I couldn't share this with anyone. The hospital had been used for criminal activities, referring to illegal trafficking. He didn't want to be explicit, but it was the real business of that senator and a criminal group carried out in the hospital's basement where only storage rooms were located. I asked how this related to what I had told him about the child. He explained that one night, a severely injured child was brought in after being hit by a car. The child was taken to intensive care and later placed in room 23. The parents said goodbye to him at visiting hour's end and went home. But the next morning when they returned, the nurses greeted them with the news that their son was no longer in the room. They had left him sleeping, but in the morning, the nurse didn't find him during her rounds. They had searched the entire hospital but found no trace of him. The parents couldn't believe what they were hearing. The mother screamed at them, asking how such negligence could happen and whether the police had been called. They were told no, as the hospital's director at the time had forbidden calling the police to avoid a scandal. The enraged father immediately alerted the authorities. The officers arrived quickly and began interrogating the staff, requesting camera footage, but were told the cameras weren't working, which was suspicious. They called for reinforcements to search the entire hospital. Upon reaching the basement, they discovered a disturbing scene. I won't be explicit, but let your imagination fill in the details. It was a slaughterhouse. They found the remains of the child, but the culprits had already fled, along with the senator, who remains missing to this day. The hospital was closed for years, and a lot of money was paid to keep this from the public, which is why not many people know the hospital's history. Returning to the child, he was one of many victims, his life taken in a horrific manner. After several years, when the hospital reopened under new ownership, many people who stayed in room 23 experienced paranormal occurrences. Many could be moved to other rooms, and some even saw and spoke with the child, who still roams those hallways. The doctor thanked me for sharing the story, which left me more nervous and somewhat sad. But now I understood who the child was and why he screamed at night. After some time, I was transferred to another hospital but remained in touch with my former floor partner, who continued to update me on the happenings in that place, especially in that room. To be honest, he had gotten used to it, but no patients were placed in that room anymore. It even remained locked. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to these stories. I hope you enjoyed them. See you in the next video. Good night.